Good to have you here. My name is Scott Engelman, and we're going to be continuing on in our study on the stewardship of power. But I want to kind of take off from what we saw there with Eric Liddell. You know, I was really impressed. I did some reading on the internet. In fact, I got a biography of his this week. I want to read it. Just an amazing guy. But he was a real man of character. And as I thought of that, and as I thought of what we see today in our own country, you know, 100 or so years later, the question I asked is, where did all the men of character go? It's interesting, in our country when it first began, there was a lot of men of character. In fact, the story of America begins with the core belief that for the nation to succeed, we need to have men of character govern the nation. And in fact, this belief is woven into our founding documents. John Adams writes, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." What's he mean by that? He's saying that we wrote a Constitution and we took everything into consideration, but the one thing that will make it work or not work is the character of the men who govern. That's what he's saying here. Now, where did this core belief originate from? Well, it came from the Founding Fathers' recognition of three key realities about power and men. First of all, men must be given power to govern the nation. If you're going to really govern, you got to have power to do it. Just full power or fake power won't really get you anywhere. So if you're going to really govern the nation, men must have real power. Secondly, men are corrupt and will misuse their power. They understood, you know, what the Bible teaches about the fallenness of man. And they recognize that man, since the fall, will use power, but will always use it in a way that's corruptible. And thirdly, they also understood that systems and policies and rules and laws will not prevent the misuse of power, no matter how good those systems and rules and laws are. Okay? So they understood those three things. So what did they do? Well, they created a written constitution, and I think it's interesting that it was a written constitution because England, from where they all came from, they have a constitution, but it's a unwritten constitution, and that's why they're having all the problems today with Brexit, because nothing is written down, and so their constitution is kind of changing. When they put our constitution together, they wrote it down. And they took these three realities in mind. First of all, men must be given power to govern. And so written into the Constitution is the idea that men will given real power to really govern. Okay, so we have, you know, the legislatures, we have the executive branch, the judges, all of that. They really have real power. And they have that power to govern. So that was put into the Constitution. Second, the idea that men are corrupt and they will misuse their power. Well, what we see is that the Constitution limits men's power. How? With checks and balances, the three branches of government, which are legislative, judicial, and executive. And those three branches all work, they limit power, and they all work as a checks and balances. At least they're supposed to, okay? But the problem is they realize that no system, no constitution, no policies are ever going to, no matter how good, will prevent the misuse of power. And so they recognize that in spite of the best they could write, the Constitution and the success of the nation still depended upon men of character that would commit themselves to the Constitution. And so then, the story of America begins with a focus on men of character. And what is woven into the founding documents is the belief that the nation will only succeed if men of character are entrusted with power to govern it, okay? That was the core belief of the Founding Fathers, and it's woven into our founding documents. And as a result, what you see in the early part of America, in its early story, America produced many men of character who used power to impact the nation for good. And here you see some pictures of those men. Now, as America's story unfolds, what happens? Well, the nation's focus shifts from men possessing character more on the idea of men possessing personality. So it goes from character to personality. And it began sometime after the Civil War in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. You see this shift taking place. And it was a result of the new emphasis on mass consumption that began with the increase of our economy, our expanding economy. Now, what does this shift look like? Well, let's make a comparison here real quickly between character and personality, okay? Character is concerned more with internal virtue. That's what you saw, with Eric Liddell. Personality is more concerned with external appearance. That's what you saw with the Olympic Committee there. They were more concerned with external appearance. Character emphasizes achievement or work. Personality emphasizes performance, what you look like. Character is focused on impacting the world. Personality is focused more on impressing people. Character is about self-denial, self-control, and self-sacrifice, whereas personality is more about self-realization, self-expression, self-fulfillment, self-gratification, okay? So those are the differences between character and personality. And what I'm saying is, as the story of America continued, it shifted from this focus on character to this focus on personality. And what was the result of this shift on our American culture? Well, what we see today is that we value men with personality while overlooking their character, right? It's all about, are they impressive? It's all about, are they able to perform? It's all about, what do they look like, irrespective of their character. One of the things that always kind of gets me is you hear, people talk about, the president or this person or that person. They gave such a great speech, and they were so impressive, and that makes them a great leader. Well, anybody can give a great speech if they're looking at a teleprompter. But they say that while they overlook character. That's one of the things that you see happening in our culture today as a result of this shift from character to personality. And in modern America, a man's personality frees him then from the constraints of character. Okay? Character is not an issue anymore. Now personality is. Now, what has this shift been on American men? How has it looked? Well, if you do an internet search, and I didn't have time to put everything down, you can do that yourselves. What you'll see is over the last 100 years, male misuse of power has been on the rise. So from this shift from character to personality has also come with it an increase of a misuse of power by men. You see that in the home. You see it in the church, spiritual abuse through the misuse of power. You see it in the community. You see it in the workplace. We see it in our government today. We see it in the schools. And as a result, we're talking about toxic masculinity. And there really is truth to that. Toxic masculinity is just masculinity gone bad. It's men who misuse their power for their own ends, irrespective of what it does with people. And as a result, they all are talking today about oppressive patriarchy. You know, men having power is a bad thing. And it makes sense when you see how the misuse of power has increased over the story of America. And if you want to make a historical observation, is what we see is that, and this is what we're going to really prove today, is this: character shapes how men use power. A man's character will always determine how he exercises power in the world as he engages the world. Okay? Now, and that then just brings us to our story, our study. Manhood, which I define as a stewardship of power, and then subtitled God's Search for a Man After Jesus' Own Heart. Now, if you've been with us, let me just give a quick review here. The purpose of this series has been to help us as men to appropriately use the power as God created us to use it. And how has God created us to use power as men? Well, on God's behalf, for God's purpose, and in God's way, right? On God's behalf, for God's purpose, and in God's way. Now, the strategy that we've looked at to achieve this purpose in this study is to ground your identity as a man in the biblical story of manhood rather than in the postmodern story of manhood. And we want to do that because in the postmodern story about men, it's growing more hostile to men. It's a story that's becoming more suspicious of power. And what it's telling us, both are oppressive. Power and men are both oppressive. They're bad things, especially when they're combined. That's the whole idea of toxic masculinity and oppressive patriarchy, okay? Now, to accomplish this purpose, we don't believe that, by the way. We believe that manhood is a good thing as God designed to be a stewardship of power in the world today for the world's good. Now, to accomplish this purpose, we've focused on three things. First of all, power, a stewardship for the world's good, and you can find this on our podcast, the first message here. We talk about that. And then we looked at this whole idea of surrender, which is the precondition for using power for the world's good. We saw that Jesus is the example. He used power, but it was first surrendered to God on God's terms, on God's behalf, in God's way. And then thirdly, what we're going to look at today is character, which we're going to describe as the force for shaping power for the world's good. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at today. Now again, just by way of review, some of the key ideas in our series. We began by talking about creation did not come into being by chance. God created it, God owns it, and He sustains it. And as a result of this, the world was created to be a place where it functioned on all 8 cylinders. The world was created to be a good place to live. It was a place of joy, and a place of wonder, and a place of that flourished in abundance. And as God created it, that's how He created it. That's called shalom, the way the world is supposed to be. And we all have this understanding that the world isn't the way it's supposed to be. And we all have this idea that it should be different, but not sure how to get there and what that will ultimately look like. Everybody has that. And what I'm saying is, and when the God first created the world, it was that. The world is a good place because it's God's good creation. And what God then did is God created man and woman, but we were focusing on man. And He created man and woman to rule jointly over creation, but we're focused on men because we need to know what that means for us, right? And we saw that we were created to rule over creation by exercising power on God's behalf, for His purposes, and in His way. And as we do that, we would be exercising a stewardship of power in the way God created us to exercise it. We would be faithful to that stewardship, faithful to what it meant to be a man in this world as God designed. Now, what happens after that? Everything was wonderful and fine? For a while, we don't know how long it was, but then something happened. Man committed treason against God. And how did he do that? Well, we saw that God owns it, but man said in essence, creation is going to be mine. I'm going to own it. And so he misused his power in order to take creation. And what happened to creation? It was fragmented. And instead of being a place of shalom, it now became a place of chaos. And the end result of all of that is we saw that man no longer is fit to rule as God created him to rule. And so then the question came, what's God going to do with his male image bearers and his broken creation? Creation is no longer the way it's supposed to be, and men are no longer the way they're created to be. Man has committed treason against God and has brought chaos into God's good world. So what's God going to do? Is he going to destroy them? Creation and men? Is he going to abandon them? Just, okay, you want to be this, I'm going to leave it and I'll go start something else. Or is he going to rid creation of men? I'm going to keep creation, but I'm going to get rid of men. That's kind of what our culture is wanting to do today, isn't it? So what is God going to do? Well, we looked at the answer to that was God begins a search for a second Adam to do what the first Adam failed to do. And what did the first Adam fail to do? Use his power to rule over God's creation on God's behalf, for God's purposes, and in God's way. So God begins this search, and when we saw that search, it took many twists and turns through the Old Testament, and it finally reaches its destination in the person of Jesus, in Jesus Christ as fully human in his incarnation. And as a man, we saw that Jesus was fit to rule because he uses his stewardship of power as God intends, for God's purposes, in God's way, and on God's behalf. He defeats evil over evil's rule over creation because evil took over the rule of creation when man committed treason by his death. Death set the creation free from evil's grasp, Jesus' death on the cross. And we saw last time that Jesus' death was his surrender of power to God. He didn't give up power, but he surrendered it to God to be used on God's behalf in God's way for God's purposes. And we said, remember last time, that our use of power is always the precondition for using power. Our surrender is always the precondition for using power. And then thirdly, we saw that he launches God's program of recreation, of making all things new by his resurrection. And so the story reaches its destination in Jesus. But we also saw that the story didn't end there. God's search for a second Adam, so to speak, didn't end with Jesus. He found the second Adam, but God just didn't stop searching. What did we say? God continued to search for men who now will reflect the heart of Jesus. And that's what God has been doing ever since the time of Jesus up until today. Today, God is searching for men who will reflect the heart of Jesus, who, like Jesus, can be entrusted with power, who, like Jesus, will surrender their power, not give up power, but will surrender power to God for God's use, and who, with Jesus, are using their power for the world's good, not for themselves, not for their own ends, not in their own way. Now, all that to say, today we want to look at this third part of our study, this whole concept of character. And we're going to ask two questions today. First, what is character? And second, what is the relationship between character and power? What's the relationship between the power God has granted to you in all the different ways we see that men possess power? What's the relationship to your power and to your character? Whatever level of character you possess today. What's that relationship? So what is character? What's the relationship between character and power? And before we get started, I want to just add a footnote here. As you read things about character, what you will discover is there's two ways to approach it. First, you can approach character from a man-centered perspective. Or secondly, what we're going to do today is you can approach it from a God-centered perspective. Now, character from a man-centered perspective was shaped by the writings of Plato and Aristotle. It begins all the way back there. And basically, they define character as a collection of moral virtues that leads to good actions that work to bring about the greatest good in a particular situation. That's how they define character in essence. And character then expressed itself through virtues of compassion, kindness, integrity, courage, self-control, wisdom, gratitude, generosity, and strength. We've all heard this, we've all seen this, and a lot of our understanding of character flows out of the writings of these men. But as good as that might be, what I want to do today is approach our understanding of character from a God-centered point of view. And rather than being shaped by Aristotle and Plato, we're going to see that this understanding is shaped by the writings of the biblical authors. And how I'm going to define character today as the image of God woven into man at creation that engages the world for God's glory. Now, we'll kind of break that down as we go, but that's my understanding. It all goes back to creation, and it all goes back to our design, what man was designed to do in his relationship to God. And it's expressed through a man's behavior as it reflects the image of God in him. I think that's a simple way to put it. Character is what your behavior looks like as it's reflecting the image of God in you. Okay? And so, well, I've said already we're going to approach character from this God-centered perspective, but what we'll see is if you do reading in either one of those, you'll see that there's great overlap. And that's okay, because guess what? Everybody possesses, all men possess what? The image of God within them. It's part of who we are as human beings. So with that in mind then, our first question, what is character? And let's start by first talking about what character is not, okay? Character is not personality traits. When we're talking about character, we're not talking about a type A personality, we're not talking about a type B personality, we're not talking about a type C personality, and neither are we talking about a type D personality, a pessimist and a stressed out kind of person. That's not what we're talking about. Now, neither are we talking about temperament types. We're not talking about sanguine. We're not talking about are you phlegmatic. We're not talking about are you melancholic. We're not talking about are you choleric. There we go. And neither, when we're talking about character, are we talking about Christian rule keeping. We're not talking about, are you keeping the 10 Commandments? That's not character, okay? We're not talking about rule keeping where it just says be good. You know, be a good husband, be a good father. That's not character. We're not talking about avoid being bad. You know, don't swear, don't cuss, don't watch porn. And neither are we talking about do more, you know, serve, give, study, pray. And neither are we talking about try harder. Really serve, really give, really study, and really pray. We're not talking about these things when we're talking about character, okay? So what are we talking about then? Well, let's just kind of build up on this so we get an idea of what character is. First of all, what is character? Character is exclusive to human beings. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is animals do not possess character. People alone possess character. Now, like people, that's my dog, and that's my son. they both possess emotion. And I don't know which one is more emotional, the dog or my son. They both possess intellect. Again, I'm not sure which one possesses more. And they both possess really strong will. You tell them what to do, and they're not sure that they want to do it. Okay? So animals are like us in that they possess emotion, intellect, and will, but unlike us, animals lack character. Okay? Animals lack character. So first of all, character is exclusive to human beings. Now, why is that? We've already kind of mentioned that. Number two, character, it's like that because character is associated with our unique creational design. Okay? Again, we go back to Genesis 1:27. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, what's this passage telling us? It's telling us basically one thing. People alone are designed to represent God in the world by reflecting him to the world. No other creature was made in the image of God. And to be made in God's image, as we've said, means that God placed us in the world to represent him to the world. And we would represent him to the world by reflecting him in the world. Now, to reflect God, what does that mean? To reflect God to the world involves reflecting God's character. If I was made to reflect God, then there's something about God I'm going to reflect. Part of the character of God is power, right? And so as men, we uniquely reflect that. Women, we said, uniquely reflect the beauty of God. But there are other things about God that we reflect as a result of being created in the image, and all those things are part of God's character. In fact, reflecting God's character is what it means to be holy. What is the holiness of God? The holiness of God doesn't mean God's really moral. The holiness of God doesn't mean God's really good. The holiness of God simply means he's like nobody else. But the holiness of God can be defined as the sum total of God's attributes. It's the sum total of all that God is, including his character. And 6 times the Bible tells us to be holy as I am holy. So, what are we saying here? We're saying that your character is unique because we are created in the image of God, and it is associated with that. Okay? Next, character is neither automatic nor of equal measure in men. What I'm saying here is character is neither automatic, it just isn't going to happen, and it's not of equal measure in men. We all don't possess the same amount of character. To bear God's image does not guarantee we will possess character. We all possess God's image, we all have God's image, but that doesn't guarantee we're all going to possess God's character. We have the potential to possess character, but it doesn't guarantee that. Animals don't have the potential to possess God's character, only we do, but because we bear the image of God, it doesn't guarantee we will. Okay? And then secondly, we all widely differ in the amount of character we possess. And what I'm saying here is that the character level is unique to every man. Every man possesses a different measure, a different level of character. Okay? Now, the question is this: why is character neither automatic nor equal? One real basic reason, and that's because your character, my character, any man's character, is contingent upon the quality of our connection to God. It's dependent on the quality of your connection to God, the quality of my connection to God. For example, as the moon was designed to reflect the character of the sun through connection, right? Here's the sun, and the moon was made to do what? Reflect the light of the sun to the world. And the way it would do that is having this connected relationship to the sun. With that connection, the moon was able to reflect the character of the sun to the world, right? Well, in the same way, men were designed to reflect the character of God through connection to God. Thus, when we have a poor connection, whether it's the sun or us, to God or to the sun, the moon or the sun, it will result in little character, right? If there is some connection that the sun and the moon have, it will result or it will reflect some character. Likewise, if there is some connection that we have with God, it will reflect some character of God. And then lastly, if there's a good connection that the moon and the sun have, it will reflect much of the character of the sun on the earth. And in the same way, if there is a good connection, a quality connection that you and I have with God, it will reflect that character of God in the earth in a way that a poor connection or some connection won't. Does that make sense? In other words, what I'm saying is this. Character in men exists on a continuum. Character in men exists on a continuum. For example, here we have our character continuum. And on one end, we have someone like, who's that? Adolf Hitler. Now, why would Adolf Hitler be on that end? Well, he had zero character because he had zero connection with God. So he manifests none of God's character. In fact, he manifests just the opposite of God's character. Now, on the other end, in his humanity, in his incarnation, we have Jesus. And what does Jesus have? Jesus has perfect character because he has perfect connection. Okay? So here's the question. Where are you on the continuum? Where are you on the continuum? Are you more on the left side with Hitler, poor because of a poor connection? Not saying you're way down there, hopefully not. Or are you more on the right side based on a good connection with God? And so what I want you to see is this. The measure of your character is always contingent upon the quality of your connection to God. And then lastly, as we're building this idea of character, character exists as the unhindered, based on all of that character is unique to people. It is associated with the image of God. It is not automatic, and neither is it of equal status. What is it then? It exists as the unhindered, and I should have had that in italics, unhindered outflowing of God's presence in a man's behavior. That's really what character is. Let me give you a couple passages. First of all, Galatians 5:16, and then 22 through 23 says, walk by the Spirit. And what's the end result of walking by the Spirit? He's going to tell us, the fruit of the Spirit. For the fruit that the Spirit produces in your life is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All those are virtues, relational virtues, that engage people, that engage the world. Another one, Ephesians 3, 8 through 9. You were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light. Reflect His light, is what he's saying here. Why? What will that look like? For the fruit of the light, or the character of the light, this is what the light looks like, within you, consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Now, there are other passages that we could look at, but just like take these couple passages and let's make a couple notes here. First of all, notice that each passage describes a partial list of the character traits of God's Spirit, or of God. I think, what are there, 9 in Galatians and 3 there in Ephesians? Well, they're not all the character traits of God. God is a God of justice. Micah tells us we're to love justice. So there are many more character traits of God, but these only a partial list. But what I want you to see is this. Both passages address those who have embraced Jesus, with the result they are now indwelt by the Spirit. These characteristics are connected with the indwelling Spirit, which is based on a man's connection to God through Jesus. Remember, what we've seen is through the fall in Genesis 3, that connection, because of treason, that connection with God was broken. And God, in His love for creation and His love for people, began to restore His creation and His image bearer. And how He had to do that through His image bearers was to restore it through the forgiveness of sin. And that's why Jesus came and died. He died not only to set creation free from the grasp of evil, He died to set us free from condemnation and guilt that we are connected through Adam with on our own treason towards Him. And so the Spirit of God indwells all who have trusted Jesus and are reconnected to God through Him. Also, both passages assume to be indwelt by God's Spirit is to have the life and presence of God existing in him. This isn't just something where God is saying, oh, God's Spirit is there somewhere, He's looking out for you. It's actually, the idea is we are now the temple. In the Old Testament, guess where God's presence dwelt? In the temple. We are now the temple, and guess where God's presence actually dwells? Within us. Next, both passages teach that the character of God will naturally flow out of the man as he is surrendered and connected to God. Notice, walk by the Spirit, walk as children of light. You know what that's in essence saying in the context? Surrender yourself to God, live in a quality connection to God. Those things result in the fruit of the Spirit, okay? The fruit of the light. And from these passages, we conclude that character exists as the unhindered outflowing of God's presence in a man's behavior. And so what is character? Well, character, as we think about it in terms of being God-centered, is exclusive to human beings. Animals don't possess it. It's associated with our unique creational design. We're made in the image of God. Neither automatic nor equal in men. Its quality of connection it's contingent on that. And then it's an outflowing of God's unhindered presence in our behavior. In essence, it's the fruit of the Spirit. Now, given all that, the question is this. What does all that have to do with our stewardship of power as men? After all, this is a series on manhood, the stewardship of power. What's it got to do with that? And maybe more particularly, what is the relationship between you as a man, your power as a man, and your character? What's the relationship between the measure of our character and how we use power as a man? That's the question we want to address after the break.
We hope that Scott's message today has encouraged you and helped you to better understand how God intended the power He gave us to be used. Please visit our website, ahm4.life, and click on the Resources tab. There you will see the Man to Man podcast and other resources we have available. At AHM, our mission is to provide hope and direction to men in a confusing world through Jesus Christ. Please continue to keep our ministry in your prayers, and if you'd like to donate to our efforts, visit our website and click on the Giving tab. Man to Man podcasts are provided by Awaken Heart Ministries, located in Troy, Michigan.